Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first session of the Legacy of Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood with instructors Sean Tatol and Domenic Hutchins. The seminar examines Michael Fried's seminal 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood, and the debates and art criticism that have surrounded it from the time of its publication to the present. Beginning with a close reading of the essay itself, we will then explore notable responses to Fried, including those by artists like Robert Smithson and Jeff Wall, as well as critics affiliated with the journal October. Special attention will be given to Fried's later text, Introduction to My Art Criticism, in which he reflects on art and objecthood 30 years later, recontextualizes its polemics as less absolute than they may initially seem, and recounts the range of reactions it provoked. The seminar culminates in a discussion of the essay's ongoing relevance to contemporary art and criticism. A key figure in our exploration will be Stephen Melville, whom Fried acknowledges as the, quote, sole exception among his critics for engaging with the actual terms of his argument. We will read Melville's 1981 essay, Notes on the Reemergence of Allegory, alongside Jeff Wall's 2006 essay, Depiction, Object, Event, which situates Fried's argument within a broader trajectory of aesthetic thought extending into the 21st century. These texts allow us to extrapolate the stakes of Fried's essay beyond its original 1967 context, moving past the minimalism versus color field binary that framed the debate at the time. Due to the complexity of the material, readings will be kept concise. The seminar's co-taught format reflects the need for collaborative unpacking of dense theoretical and art historical texts, with the goal of giving students the tools to engage Fried's legacy rigorously and critically. Sean Tatol is an art critic based in New York City. He writes primarily on his website, the Manhattan Art Review. The Manhattan Art Review favors short-form reviews of art exhibitions with a 5-star rating system, prioritizing strong and potentially divisive opinions in contradiction to the polite conventions of mainstream art writing. By this approach, he aims to emphasize the importance of judgment in art criticism, in the hopes of fostering a functional arts discourse that welcomes disagreement, debate, and renewed attempts to grapple with the complexities of art. Domenic Hutchins received a BA from Bard College and an MA in Theory and Criticism from Western University. His criticism has been published or is forthcoming in Bologna, Caesura, and the Manhattan Art Journal, He's also a musician and concert organizer and has worked in the antiquarian book trade for the past decade. And so Sean, Domenic, go for it.
Cool. So Dominic, you wanted to do a little intro to
Yeah, so I hope everyone can hear me all right. First off, I'd like to say that I'm very pleased to be teaching this seminar with Sean and at the New Center, no less. I've prepared some general remarks for our first session. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point or to save questions for the discussion. Some of these remarks will be a bit autobiographical and will explain the origins of this seminar, as well as my own relation to Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood. My hope is that spelling out the origins of the class will help to articulate and clarify its stakes. So I think the following is a fairly common trajectory for many like myself who were schooled at liberal arts colleges in North America. In the only art history class I took in college, an Intro to Art History 101 class, we looked at and analyzed Cindy Sherman's mock film stills from the late 70s and early 80s, along with a range of other post-minimalist art, such as that of Richard Serra, Robert Smithson, and Richard Prince. But it was only in graduate school that I first read and encountered Michael Fried's Art and Objecthood, and so also first encountered, via that essay, minimalism. Unless you major in art history in college, I would imagine that most first read Art and Objecthood in graduate school. From the moment I first encountered the text, I began to wrestle with it, and over the past decade, I've returned again and again to the essay. In retrospect, I understand my own research and studies as almost inevitably leading me to Fried's text and the range of ideas it explores. There was a strong presence of Stanley Cavell's philosophy at my undergraduate by way of an in-law of his who taught there. And I was exposed to Stephen Melville's work during college because he taught for a period at my undergrad as a visiting professor, but as a visiting professor of philosophy, not art history. Stephen Melville probably stands as the best commentator on the subtextual dialogue between Cavell and Fried, bringing out their shared intellectual project and underlining where Fried and Cavell are collaborating. Melville has also distinguished himself as a leading commentator on Fried, a task that is not an easy one. This seminar very much emerged out of Sean and my email correspondence. Over the past year, we've discussed at length Melville's art criticism, and particularly its relation to Fried's art and objecthood. Our correspondence has largely developed out of a shared interest to rethink the 60s and 70s, rather than engage in what Sean has variously called head-in-the-sand modernism or zombie formalism. On the uses and abuses of Marxism for art criticism, I would highly recommend Sean's newest piece on his Substack, and now triple ampersand, entitled Marxist Citationalism. So here's some excerpts from our emailings over the past year. Here's me. It's really interesting to use art and objecthood as a starting point of sorts to think about contemporary art, or at least this is what Stephen Melville has made me believe. The piece seemingly raises all of the crucial questions and problems surrounding contemporary art and its criticism, namely judgment, voice, expression, description, experience, and its disproof, avant-garde versus modernism, the list goes on. Here's Sean from our emailing. Quote, I was just explaining to someone why art criticism tends to have such a short expiration date. Even criticism by talented critics like Greenberg or Gary Indiana only really have a mostly academic historical interest because we only really get a sense of how people looked at art at the time. The judgments themselves are usually dated and not very useful for us now. That's what's so insane about art and objecthood. It's this huge problematizing slab of the conditions of art since the 60s that broaches almost every thorny dynamic underlying all of it. And no matter how anyone takes the essay, those problems just won't go away. It's one of the very few pieces of 20th century art writing that still feels totally relevant and vital, close quote. So because I'm going to be covering the texts by Stephen Melville in this seminar, I'd like to offer a brief overview of his approach to art and objecthood. So Melville's work is good to engage when reading art and objecthood because his work decidedly does not settle the problems raised by the essay, but if anything, heightens and clarifies them. Melville may be said to organize the pathologies surrounding the text, and more than anyone else to my knowledge, he has made a strong case for the essay's pedagogical use, as we will see explicitly in our fourth session. Melville's body of work effectively proposes the idea of teaching art history and approaching contemporary art through Fried's art and objecthood. In this seminar, Melville figures as something very much like Fried's defense attorney, and yet, as we will see, he also violates Fried's own express wish to keep his art criticism separate from the art historical work he has produced. So in notes on the Reemergence of Allegory, as we will see, Melville openly aligns himself with Fried's project and reflexively observes in the essay how his article notes can be seen as, quote, forcing a certain acknowledgement of Fried. As Sean put it in an email to me, quote, Melville is still maybe the only one who's managed an adequate approach to art and objecthood. And Sean goes on, what I find so valuable about Melville's approach to his own era is that he managed to consider high modernism from an October adjacent position instead of militantly rejecting it, and in doing so, expose the limits of both as things that we can move beyond, close quote. Because Melville has hung his hat on art and objecthood, he, even more than Fried, is one of our best guides to working through minimalism and its afterlife. These are matters we will return to for our second and fourth sessions. So now for a brief note on the October Art Journal, which was founded in 1976. This seminar probably could have just as easily been titled something like Rethinking the October Art Journal, even though we do include as many pieces in the syllabus from art form as from October. In most accounts of this period we are examining, Rosalind Krauss and Douglas Crimp, the editors of October, tend to take the lead. And most critical accounts today usually consist of simply dismissing both of them. And on this matter, I would confer the scholarship of Chris Cutrone. It is, of course, curious that we have not selected any readings of theirs, of Krauss's or Crimp's, but their presence will nevertheless be in the background and will crop up from time to time in the seminar. We had originally included an essay by Krauss in the syllabus, but decided not to include it in the final instance. In this seminar, we are offering an unmistakably heterodox and unconventional approach to this material. It's important to clarify that we're not primarily aiming to teach the material in a conventional academic sense, but rather to use the readings to frame how these ideas work as a way of getting at impasses and dynamics in the present, whether they're inherited from the 60s or assuming or taking on new forms. We're also not going to simply take or affirm one side of the argument between, on the one hand, modernism, color field painting, and formalism, and on the other, minimalism and postmodernism. It's worth emphasizing that Melville is virtually the only precedent we really have that isn't polarized on one side or the other. When we read Jeff Wall's essay for our third session, we can assess the extent to which he offers us a non-polarized response to art and objecthood. But as Sean recently pointed out to me, quote, it is easier for artists to be ambivalent in these kinds of debates. In the course description, we've posed the task of extrapolating the stakes of Fried's essay beyond its original 1967 context, moving past the minimalism versus color field binary that framed the debate at the time. Melville's 1981 essay, Notes on the Reemergence of Allegory, published in October, gets us halfway there to such extrapolation. In the essay, he places the debates of art and objecthood in relation to not only Fried's work in art history, at the time 1980s absorption and theatricality, but also the debates in October. This was a fertile period for October, the journal's first 5 years, embracing Crimp's 1979 Pictures essay, Craig Owens's essays on postmodernism and the allegorical impulse, as well as Melville's notes. This class then seeks to wrestle with both art and objecthood as well as the legacy of October, and it's easy to imagine future iterations of this seminar, perhaps narrowing in a bit more explicitly on October's legacy. It's in October, after all, where the afterlife of minimalism gets thought through, even though it is in the pages of art form where art and objecthood is first published. In the piece by Krauss, we almost included, entitled The Cultural Logic of the Late Capitalist Museum from 1990, Krauss is wrestling with what has been called the cultural construction of minimalism. That is, what minimalism becomes after the 60s. If this class primarily takes as its main object the stretch of time spanning from the 60s to the 80s, October lies rather conveniently smack dab in the middle, being founded in 1976. It's important to note in passing that one of the important legacies of October was that of legitimating postmodernist art, giving it theoretical and critical justification. October was also an important conduit through which French theory entered America. So by French theory, I mean structuralism and post-structuralism, and so also deconstruction. The other important conduit through which French theory entered America being literary studies. We will return to deal with October more in depth after we look at Melville's essay notes in the second session. A last note I'd like to make on the flow of the seminar, so the four kind of sessions as they unfold. One interesting thing that the sequence of essays we are reading does, from art and objecthood, particularly to the pieces I'm covering, Melville's notes, and then to Alexander Albero's essay, Turn of the Screw. One thing this sequence of text does is dramatize the birth of institutional critique, which minimalism's insistence on site specificity gives rise to. Melville's notes also helps us approach the so-called pictures generation of the late 70s and early 80s, not only through the lens of minimalism and its aftermath, but also through the lens of what Melville variously calls Greenberg's or Fried's revenge, meaning the recovery of the pictorial image in the art of the late 70s and early 80s. Finally, reading Melville's Art and Objecthood word for word in our fourth session, a pedagogically oriented approach to Fried's essay, is intended to return us to where we started with Art and Objecthood and to keep the questions it raises alive. This is definitely not easy material, and so I think it's good to emphasize the overall arc of the seminar, which may help to keep things in perspective. The supplemental readings we included for today's session are intended as background reading and are meant to help clarify the debates and deadlocks we are going to get into today. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Sean, who's I think going to be kind of spearheading this session, and particularly the reading of Art and Objecthood and Smithson's reply.
Thanks, Dominic. So another thing about the structure of the course is that Dominic prepares his what he's going to say, and I don't. So I will also encourage you to jump in and ask any questions because I'm not going to be able to improvise for 2 hours straight on my own. So I guess the easiest place to start is, I guess, my own relationship to art and objecthood, which is a lot shorter story than Dominic's, in that I think I only read it 3 years ago or something, and I think reading it again for this course was probably the third time I've read it. So it's a pretty I've had a pretty brief relationship compared to people who I mean, I didn't take any intro to art history classes in school, so it's all been self-taught and sort of, I'd never read Greenberg when I started writing, so it's all been kind of like playing catch up for a few years. But the interesting thing about the 3 times I've read Art and Objecthood is that the first time I read it, I had the usual response that most people do, which is the minimalist position, where you agree that Fried is identifying the dynamics in the work correctly, only you flip the judgment of his dismissal as an approval that this is a valid form of art. And then the second time I read it, I found myself agreeing more with Fried, or sort of seeing the built-in limitations to the sort of minimalist project that I guess I'll go into that in a bit. But the reading it the third time, and sort of this is what I had already come to before the third reading, just sort of thinking through these things, is that if like the first time I read it, I didn't even really know what color field was. Like I knew a few names and stuff, but I really wasn't familiar with it being a sort of counter movement against minimalism in the 60s. And then around the second time, I was sort of like amused by this sort of neglected contingent. And there's this one gallery in New York called Yaris Art that seems to represent the estate for every color field artist. So I've been a handful of times, and a lot of that work is really exciting the first and second time you see it, and then the fifth time you're seeing a Morris Louis, and it's like seeing one or two Morris Lewises spread out over 3 years or whatever. You're kind of like, have I seen this one? I'm not sure if I have, because he does the same shape 100 times, and it's really hard to care if you have seen it or not, because I mean, I think being engaged with sort of the way that those artists worked at the time, there was some interest in sort of the whatever the way they were using color and paint and luster, whatever. But it's really hard to care now, in part because the work really isn't accessible um, outside of what Yaris Art decides to do every year, which is, like 4 exhibitions. Um, so my point is that in the third reading, I've kind of come around to the decision that the minimalists are wrong, Freed and the color fieldists are wrong, like everyone's wrong. Um, which is not, I think, which isn't to say that I agree or disagree with either side. It's that, um, which is, and this is, I think, the kind of core that we'll return to again and again through this course is that the debate being staged in art and objecthood is historical and tied to the world of 1967 in a way that is very different from the world we're in now. And I think that there's a lot of continuing misunderstandings of that debate and sort of, the particularly, sort of the embrace of minimalism as something that should be embraced and Greenberg and Fried as these sort of heretics that should be oppressed or, ignored. Um, and that I think, the a sort of, I wouldn't even call it a synthesis of both sides, but a sort of historical morphing of both positions that is only really possible in retrospect from the present. Um, I think has I suspect there's a way to sort of reconcile these positions um, into a current, a 2026 position towards art that is not picking sides in a debate from 60 years ago. And uh, and I think that's the thing, something I said to Dominic the other day was that um, something that's important in or impressive really about Smithson's response from Art Forum right after the piece was written is that he from the start, even though he's obviously on the minimalist side, his critique of Freed isn't sort of um, an attack in the way that October's rhetoric towards Freed would be, but rather a sort of um, diagnosis of what is implicit in Freed's position, which is to say that he understands that it's not really A versus B or one side versus the other, but rather sort of a phenomenon that is trying to be addressed, and that the phenomenon is bigger than picking one side or the other. And then that what I also said to Dominic was that Melville is the real that's why he's so good on art and objecthood is he's practically the only person who's over time been able to sustain an inquiry into art and objecthood that doesn't treat it as um, a a debate between two sides, but a dynamic on its own level. But so um, something that just to get it out of the way to begin with is that Michael Fried is really weird. He's a bizarre writer. He's a really strange writer. I like him a lot. He's a very interesting writer, but he's also sort of a problem in a very difficult, sort of complicated, amorphous way. And that is not just true of his critical work and art and objecthood, but in his art historical work as well. Like um, his book on Courbet is one of the most like freakish, hallucinatory um, uh, games of interpretation where um, the whole time you're reading it, you're kind of like, are you serious, this argument you're making right now? But if you follow him through with it, I think it does end up illuminating something about Courbet and the work. And then I think at the end of that book, he also has a passage, or maybe it's in the general afterword, that he sort of reflects to himself, well, how much do I even believe what I'm saying? Like I believe it, which is why I'm saying it, but like I also know it's not the absolute truth. And and the thing about that, which is interesting, is the way Freed is this weird middle position between Greenberg as a sort of quote unquote traditional formalist that so much of postmodernism and particularly October is in direct opposition to, is that Freed is uh, a more complex thinker. I think he's Greenberg can get pretty sloppy rhetorically and philosophically in his sort of more um, whatever theoretical arguments, and I think Freed is better informed. But the fact that Freed is better informed, but still tries to cling to this sort of formal logic that he received from Greenberg, makes him a more difficult. Like I would say that Greenberg's position is more understandable because his blind spots are so obvious. They're so kind of on the surface and so like intrinsic to his idea of his view of art as a coherent system. Whereas Freed's complexity of his position is also a sort of incoherence on some level, where you're just kind of like, well, how the hell do you actually like really believe in color field if you know this much about phenomenology and everything? Which is also, I think, the thing about art and objecthood itself, which is the sort of, if you understand minimalism so well, how can you hate it so much? Um, and that I think, is the great problem of art and objecthood on some level. There's a lot of great problems of it, so it's that's not the entirety of it, but um, yeah. So I guess a good place to start is sort of trying to set some ground facts about sort of the argument that's being made and the the history of minimalism as we see it now as something which is, historicized and part of the canon. And I think the fact that, Donald Judd and the rest of them are, canonical figures is a something that can be easy to miss when you're sort of trying to grapple with Freed or with art and objecthood, is that this subject, that him sort of saying this stuff is um uh, uh empty or hollow, and that it is not, he compares interestingness versus conviction, and he says this work lacks conviction. But I don't think that argument holds water now that these artists are canonized. And that, I think, is sort of the initial ground of the difficulty of the argument, is um, that he lost, that Colorfield lost. Minimalism won. Minimalism is the historically important art from the 60s. And I don't know, maybe I'm there's something not edgy, but I guess it's maybe an outspoken position in from my point of view, but I do think that there's something um, factual about not the canon itself, but the sort of the history of art as it played out, it is set in stone because it is history, and it is, like the important artists are the artists that were important and influence other artists. And like you can dig up less important artists and say that they shouldn't have been neglected and should have been important, but they weren't. And the way the lineage of art carries out is is settled on some level. Um, so that um, the so yeah, on the one hand, I think it's important to keep in mind that it is ultimately a losing argument that Fried is making, and that um, throws his critiques in a certain light. But that also isn't to say that he lacks any sort of direction, or that his observations are valueless, because I do think that there are this is what Melville calls, Fried and Greenberg's revenge, I think, is well, maybe not even what Melville means by it, but because I'm not even necessarily thinking about the pictorial, but rather that I think there are long-term issues to the um, exercise of what minimalism was interested in, that are unsettled, and I'm interested in thinking them through, but I think they're a bigger problem than I've had time to sort of put my mind to. But I think the way I think it through, and this is something I had um, suspected on my own for a long time, but then David Sally wrote a review of Donald Judd's MoMA retrospective from, I think, 2019. And he says in his review that there was a sort of um, like charge, or sort of uh, what's the word, like in impassivity to the work, in the very fact of Donald Judd being an artist who is out there in the world, who really believes with the whole of his being that these boxes are the essence of art, and that this is important. These boxes are what it's all about. And now that he's dead, I think that it's a serious problem that that verve is lost in the work. Particularly, I mean, this is how I came to the conclusion, was, seeing his work at, Gagosian uptown, or just some random secondary market gallery. It's sort of like generally just sort of a weak design element. I mean, not that I dislike the work, but there's a sort of triteness that I think is not true of his work when it's presented at Judd Foundation spaces, where he, spent his life curating the space to reflect the work, and for the two to interact in a very, serious, committed manner. So that, I think, is the issue, is that these sort of minimalist artists were um, they're engaging, in a thing that is far beyond the art object. And Fried and Greenberg were trying to say that that movement beyond the object itself is invalid or wrong, and history has disagreed with them. And I think we have to take it as given that that those sort of dynamics of space and um, whatever else that minimalist and post-minimalist artists were working with are now considered valid terms of art. Um, but the complexity of those elements outside of the object itself that artists managed as they were making their work is something that I think becomes more and more um, tenuous as time goes on. And that that's a problem. I think that's like Stanley Brown. I had the same thought regarding his work that sort of um the work is kind of annoying and pretentious, like, oh, you can't take photos of it, and it's just like a line on a piece of paper, like, shut up. But the fact is that this guy spent his life doing it. And, like, I know people who, were students of artists who knew him. And, like I guess Christopher Williams says, Stanley Brown was the coolest fucking guy on earth. And, so like, I think just a simple observation like that is, a validating term to me of the validity of Brown's work. But it's more like hearing that he was really cool is almost more important than it is for me to see the work to understand that he was a good artist. So I think, there's a sort of ambiguity that really starts seeping in, and that is starts, kind of dripping out as time goes on. So a way that I think I was thinking of framing this problem is even beyond the sort of issue of the curatorial issues of, how having Donald Judd around to be a tight ass about how his work is installed being like integral to the work. Um, the I've started to suspect that the conditions are simply historical on some level, which is to say that the art world, particularly in New York and in the sort of global, contemporary art world at the time, that these sort of terms and conditions that allowed for the beginning of minimalism and then sustained this sort of radical art, particularly through the 60s and 70s, were a set of like contingent terms that were sustained by a collective that understood the rhetoric surrounding it and was attuned to, the experiential conditions of it. And that um, I don't think those conditions are present anymore. And so there's a sort of um, not that information is inaccessible now. It's just not the frame. And and that there's, been a sort of I think, the uh, I'm very tired of, the claims about an art's need for like a new avant-garde or innovation or whatever these days. And I think one of the easiest ways to sort of disprove that argument is to simply point out that there's been an obvious, clear regression in terms of the, intellectual sophistication of art over the last 50 odd years. That and that whatever, you can blame that on any number of conditions, but I think maybe particularly in the last 20 years, and whatever, Art Basel, Miami, blah blah blah, like the um the whatever rhetorical standards or the level of engagement necessary to sort of be taken seriously as a member of the art world have dropped precipitously. And that drop has a has consequences in terms of um, not only like what you can get financed and get people to buy, but like I think literally on the level of the art itself, the sort of conditions to be a minimalist are intellectually not present anymore. And there's a sort of inaccessibility that comes into the work through this. So, I think this whole problem does validate the Freudian perspective on some level. That like the um, the need to sort of have like a presence in an artwork, like that a painting, you receive sort of the decisions of an artist through looking at the way they painted something. Those decisions are sort of palpably in front of you, and that, a Bruegel is still accessible in that way. Whereas a box by Judd is less accessible in that way. Not which is not to say that I think Judd's decisions and his artwork was a valid pursuit. I don't think it was invalid, but I do think that there's a sort of um, ambiguity in the sort of continuing life of the work. And let's see. Any questions yet? I'm just looking over my notes to try to remember the things I thought. Um, so let's see. So yeah, I think, a good maybe way to continue that line of thought is that Freed is um, fears the sort of loss of the ability to judge art, and that's a fair claim from his position that the terms by which he relates to the judging of art um, are under threat from minimalism, and the minimalists knew that, and that's something he mentions by saying how the people, the minimalists would say, what I'm not sure what I'm doing is art, or things of that nature. Like there was a sort of um feeling of pushing these boundaries that made sort of the terms of engagement ambiguous. Um, but now those terms are uh, understandable to us. They have been sort of historicized and therefore are sort of accessible. But yeah, one way of putting it is that the yeah, I mean, I guess what I've already said is that the minimal an experience of a minimalist artwork is more fickle, I think, than a painting. The sort of refusal of form or whatever is a um an attack on the art that came before it. But I think, and this is sort of the wider ramifications of this problem with minimalism as we see it today, is that the um that you have to look back at it and say, did minimalism succeed in being, specific objects and not sculpture? And I don't think it did. I don't think it truly broke the historical sort of continuum of art object making. I think they are sculptures. I think they expanded sculpture hugely, um, but what that is, Rob, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that was one of the things I struggled with when I was first reading the essay,
Mhm.
was um, his insistence on art resisting becoming a mere object. Because I just kept coming back to like hadn't conceptualism, Dada, like Duchamp, hadn't they already sort of challenged that? Um,
Yeah, I would say that I think my understanding of the history is that um, the ramifications of those, 1910s era gestures were only really embraced and taken seriously by artists in the 60s. So that was sort of the era when, the ready-mades, everyone was obsessed and sort of like, oh, this is the craziest thing. Like, this is really changing up art. It wasn't completely ignored in the tens, but people really didn't know what to do with it, I think, until the 60s or so. Is that more or less what you were
Yeah,
thinking?
yeah.
Okay. Um, so this is I knew I had a more sophisticated thought bubbling up that I was trying to remember. So I think the way I would frame the divide between, I guess we'll just say Freed, but I put kind of Greenberg behind him implicitly in everything I think about with this debate, partly because I was just reading late Greenberg a few months ago. But between the sort of, you know, Freudian formalist, whatever you want to call it, side, and the minimalist side, there's a separation basically in the dialectic between the viewer or the subject and object, basically. The artwork is an object, and the Fried and Greenberg, as critics, privilege the viewer's relationship to the object, and that they want this sort of precedence of the experience of viewing and judging. And that's in one of the side things, something good that Melville notes in his bio of Freed is that the reason he kind of dismisses minimalism is that for Freed, description of an artwork is implicit in the judgment, or the judgment is implicit in the description of the artwork, and that's what writing about art is. So from his perspective, if the experience is not in the work, then the work is nothing. And that I think is, a pretty succinct way of putting what Freed's basic issue is. But I think again that the terms of assuming that an art object has to be self-contained is now just indefensible. So so on the formalist critic side, there's the precedence of viewing and judging and description and that level of sort of um, reflective, self-critical, whatever you want to call it, experience of apprehending the object. And what the minimalists are focused on is the artist's relationship to creating an object or to what making an object or what it's not even obviously it's not about objecthood. It's that being an artist and making an artwork is fundamentally not making the object, or it is more than or sort of adjacent to this object, but the actual content itself is not fundamentally, the craftsmanship of making. That there is a sort of experiential dimension in making art that is not fundamentally, craft. And this is, where Tony Smith comes in, and the fact of lived experience of apprehending a half-finished highway is an experience that is similar to art, but is not art. And I think that's maybe sort of one of the distinctions that Smithson makes against Freed is that the the just because Tony Smith says, this is the end of art, that I've had this experience on a freeway, it doesn't mean that he considers that experience itself art. It's just that he has an experience, and the immensity of sort of one's awareness in space is um in some way beyond the specificity of an art object, and that doesn't have as it's not as sort of apocalyptic as Freed sort of makes it to be. And I think that's sort of what Smithson is basically teasing him for, is this fear of the uh you know what he refers to as like the infinite. Um and and so I think this is a that thing of, the Freed privileges and focuses on the sort of like specificity of the experience of the art object, whereas minimalists sort of want this wider idea of experience to be sort of filtered into objects, leads to one of the funniest contradictions in the text to me, which is the last sentence: presentness is grace. Because I have no idea what he's talking about, really. Like, I mean, I can guess, but my what I take him to mean uh is totally confounding, because it's like, well, what is the experience of being in a room with a minimalist object other than presentness? Isn't isn't sort of your awareness of your spatiality or next to a object exactly the presentness of um like, I don't know how to differentiate the presentness of looking at an artwork versus the presentness of being next to a minimalist artwork. I mean, there are differences, but I don't know even how you would make a sort of categorical differentiation of um these two things. I think that there's just a profound ambiguity in the claim of presentness, uh, from the start. And so the sort of, conviction clearly that he ends on that line is almost one of the weirdest parts of it, that he kind of he thinks that it's a sort of, a capstone to his argument. But to me, it underscores precisely Smithson's argument, which is sort of that uh, that Freed himself is theatrical, and that, these differentiations of presentness or objecthood versus the theater that he thinks is an offense to art, is actually in the he can't, it's sort of like a there's a sense when I look back at Freed's arguments that it's a sort of, and especially maybe it's especially because it's even clearer with Greenberg in his like late lectures, that it's a feeling of sort of a boat taking on water, and like trying to, get scoop it out in your hands, but it's coming on too fast, and that you should just like start swimming. And that, we're all swimming now. So it's sort of like, you're digging up a boat and trying to figure out what people thought they were doing with this boat. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I think those are kind of like my unless I really sat down and reread my notes again, I could drum up some other things, but I think that's maybe a beginning of sort of the problem of art and objecthood, at least as I see it in the present. I don't know. Does anyone have anything to ask or anything? My cat sneezing. Yeah.
I'm not an art history, like I haven't studied art history, so maybe my questions could be kind of basic, but like kind of wanted to ask, I mean, in the text there was like some paragraphs I think about that was like related to like how each domain of art is kind of with the minimalism, I think, is kind of like turning back to their own origins and are
Hmm.
not being like influenced by other domains. And
Hmm.
this was, I think, about the literal art. But like what I understood by this argument or by the criticism is that like the minimalist art is not actually minimalist, because like what it minimizes in materiality or in sensibility, it like relocates to different places, such as like relation, like you have to be in that space and you have to like relate it to another concepts in your mind, or like you cannot re-experience or revisit that uh, time, so it's
Hmm.
not really in contained in the art piece. So is it like related to like how it's actually is not succeeding at what it aims? Is this one of the criticism? This is my first question, I think, and couldn't quite understand what that term theater means there. Like,
Hmm.
what is the accusation with the theater? I
Yeah,
couldn't get
well,
that. Yeah.
that's the classic misunderstanding. And I think that's, this isn't just an aside, but one of the things that comes up that Dominic mentioned briefly is that Fried insists on his art history writing being separated from his criticism, and that I think one of the biggest issues is that, his kind of great idea of his art historical writing is that uh, the great idea is the idea of absorption versus theatricality, and that so he's using the word theatricality in theater again, but in, referring to Jacques-Louis David and uh, Manet, his idea of theatricality is um, kind of adjacent to how he talks about minimalism, but it's fundamentally a different concept. Um, which is just to say he uses theater in his writing a lot as a sort of negative term, and it's a really fraught and difficult uh, thing to sort of wrap your head around. But um, I mean, I don't know, Dominic, do you have a easier explanation of theater?
I mean, I think something that Stephen Melville will emphasize is that in for our next session is that absorption and theatricality are ultimately dialectical concepts,
Hmm.
and I think as Sean is pointing out in Fried's book on Manet, there's actually a pretty it's not that he's valorizing theatricality, but all of a sudden theatricality takes on a whole new kind of meaning in his book on Manet, and I think this comes out also in the response. Is it to TJ Clark on how modernism works? We didn't assign that, but
Oh yeah.
where he's kind of um, yeah, kind of giving a much more charitable reading or way of thinking about theatricality as not necessarily a negative, like a priori negative or pejorative term. And I think one note I had for today was, I think in some ways the task that Fried sets for himself after Art and Objecthood is that of in some ways redeeming the idea of theatricality, and I think
Mm.
this is in some ways you can see how his his art historical monographs are very much kind of interested in redeeming that idea of theatricality, because obviously, yeah, it takes on a very negative valence in Art and Objecthood. Um, to the
Yeah.
extent that you would think that absorption is the only good, is like this God term or something.
Right. Yeah, yeah, I guess just to try to actually give a idea of it is, I think So what your first question was about this sort of idea of medium specificity, that's really what Fried takes from Greenberg. And that's kind of his great theory is that these each sort of medium of art has its own specific terms, and that the refinement and development of those specific terms within its own medium is what determines what quality is in painting. And his idea was that the abstract painting was heightening paintings essential value as flatness, and that sort of emphasizing flatness is intrinsic to art. And that I think this isn't the definition of theater, but part of his issue is that and it is sort of reflected in the way minimalists talk about their own work in the quoted text is the sort of um refusal of painting, and the refusal, and the sort of not wanting to be sculpture, and the sort of uh complicating, and yeah, kind of attempting to land at specific objects or whatever as a post medium condition. So that's, I think, one of the major sort of sticking points of sort of the issue to Fried, is that he wants the mediums to stay specific, and minimalists are trying to directly push against this idea of medium specificity. But I think specifically you could just say theatricality is this sort of uh, movement of the place of the artwork's content away from the intrinsic, materiality of the object itself, to sort of concerns about space and presence and physicality, and and just like whatever, like a Richard Serra is a giant piece of metal that being in a room with it feels, it overtakes you in a certain way, and that's sort of the terms on which minimalism works, and that those terms aren't quite sculpture. I mean, I guess Serra considered himself a sculptor, but the ambiguity of sort of those terms of how they work is, I think, the best I can do in terms of defining theater. But I think what he means by theater is ambiguous, and to some degree should be kept ambiguous. Peggy, did you have a question?
No, I had a comment. I was going to say, and this is totally without any philosophical ramifications we find
Mhm.
it. I think the end of Kubrick's 2001 really would be presence is grace.
Yeah.
I mean, because when you think about it, it's the finite going into the infinite. It's everything that's concerned in this particular piece. It's inescapable. There's a lot of silence and absorption in it. And it's 1968, so I feel like it fits.
Mhm.
So,
No, I think that's a great point, and I think it's something I've sort of been thinking about generally, is this um the sort of like countercultural, you know, energy that is so, paradigmatically associated with the 60s, and this sort of excitement about sort of the, break from stuffy old painting and stuff. Like it's an interesting thing to me, because it's so, I guess it's just a thing of like, my exposure to culture and the arts was non-denominational and very much not focused on visual art for like the entirety of my 20s. I came pretty late to knowing anything about contemporary art. And, so it's sort of like a thing of, realizing the ways in which the uh, kind of explosion that's happening in the rhetoric surrounding art itself in the 60s around minimalism and all that is on some level related to Stanley Kubrick's 2001, The Beatles, like counterculture, hippies, like that. The sort of there was a reconfiguration of the understanding of reality going on, and that it's maybe a good way of sort of framing why people have been so repulsed by Fried and Greenberg for so long. It's that like it's sort of like a the tattletale on the playground, like, saying like you guys can't throw rocks or whatever. Like it's, like there's a, I think that's a great way of sort of seeing the conservatism of it being like, no, we need to keep doing art like we did in the 50s. And that how someone living in the 60s would be like, fuck you, man. Like,
Yeah,
obviously that's not going to work.
but then I have one other comment. I live
Mhm.
miles away from the British Art Museum, and when I got to the end of thing about presence being art and the fact that, this big giant object is in my place, and so I sort of have to pay attention to it. If you go, there's one room in the British Art Center, which I call the huge people,
Mm.
because all the aristocrats have pictures that are 12 feet tall. So they just overwhelm you, which is what they're
Mhm.
supposed to do, because
Yeah.
that's what was important then. So without putting this in a time reference, I don't know where we are with this.
Hmm.
I don't think this sits well with us now.
Yeah.
Any, you know, because presence is everything. Present, and it never stops. It's just random, more than
Yeah.
random.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is sort of, the the issue to me, I think, is, you look at, Velasquez painting those big people, and, it was his job. He was a court painter, did what he was told to do, painted the people he was paid to paint. Um, but he's, one of the greatest painters of all time. And, these sort of the socially instilled standards of what the artist should do, religious scenes, aristocrats, etc. Those standards were kind of imposed absolutely, but because they were imposed absolutely, they were also kind of um, easy to sidestep, or that the artist's sort of relationship to their work could be kind of left alone to get on with it and do what they wanted to do, as long as they sort of met these basic subject matter standards. And that I think the increasing ambiguity of sort of what art does and how it does it and where the value comes from and where it goes and what we're doing at all has gotten more and more complex over time and more muddled. And that, and I think that that's sort of, that's where, I think the sort of thesis of our argument, the Dominic and I have, is that um, that maybe, the sort of side of the post-structuralist notion of freedom has not, sort of paid dividends at this point. And that, in revisiting subjects like Fried and Greenberg, it's not to say that we should revert to a modernist traditionalism, because I don't think that's possible. Like, when you've seen everything that's happened in, if you've ever engaged with art made since the 60s, like, these terms are palpably there. It's just the difficulties of how we sort of do whatever art does has gotten screwy or sort of run aground or something, and that I think a dose of the rhetoric that Fried and Greenberg had, the sort of ideas, what repulsed them about this work, contains within it maybe a kernel of, not an antidote or something, but there's a sort of um, a implicit middle ground or something that can be sort of drawn out of the problem we're in with art today. Yeah, Luis.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have some questions around, I mean, some of what you're saying too about like kind of like how these criticisms could also come into now.
Mhm.
But they also came from the reading of like, I think one of the really interesting for me is like after reading criticism, after kind of coming from my own BA, is thinking a lot about how criticism of this time for me, like structurally, like how the argument is made and what are the interests and like what is like the object of what criticism looks like for me is really interesting to think of like now what criticism in art is right now.
Yep.
And even coming from a kind of a short point you made at another point, I think, I mean, even I'm based in Mexico right now, and I could say that even some of the criticism that's being produced in Mexico City right now, some of the biggest criticism isn't even about art, and it has a lot to do with like the infrastructure of art. Like I think even a kind of article that blew up a few days ago was literally about like, oh, advocating for artists, curators, and institutions to be more transparent with finances, and this was art criticism. So
Yeah.
I think that like one of the things that I kind of look at, like looking at this thing and kind of had questions about it because I'm not kind of an expert in this time period. I think one of the first questions I had was like, I mean, obviously I'm sure that, since you were saying this is like pre-institutional critique, there's like a kind of slippery kind of idea of what art infrastructure is at this point. And I'm sure like art infrastructure is like a narrative of the time now. But I
Mm.
was interested in that kind of like in all of the critique, it is super just directed to artists and kind of this idea that like art is moved and ideas in art are moved through artists. There's no mention of institutions. There's no real mention of like other publications. So I was interested in like, was there already an imaginary of an arts infrastructure, or was kind of like the onus of what minimalism is moving, was it just on artists? And then kind of the other question around that was also, then is this, because this is a text I hadn't read before in my kind of own history of art history. And I guess in a very interesting way, I guess thinking about it now, I was biased because I ended up reading a lot of like Smithson and Judd and Krauss and October, and not necessarily ever like a critical position here. So I
Mm.
was also wondering, like, is this a text that's kind of just mentioned during that time as a critique, or is it mentioned on its own in another sort of like structure? Like, what's like the canonization of this text in the U.S.?
Yeah. So first I'll do the second question, which is, yeah, I think it was sort of canonized as a sort of punching bag for a really long time, and sort of like either reviled or, like I said, the people said, oh, well, this is a good description of minimalism. I'm going to use it, but I'm not going to say it's bad. And that sort of, I mean, the short answer is that Fried stopped writing criticism. Uh, I don't think it was the last thing he wrote of criticism, but he did
By
pretty.
1970. I think it's
Yeah.
1970. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So like, yeah, within a couple of years, he basically dropped out of writing contemporary art criticism and um, became a historian, and didn't really touch any contemporary art for uh, the until his photography book, which was maybe 30 years later, close to 30 years later. So yeah, he was basically run out of town for it. And it was sort of, I think, there were debates ongoing about the I don't know, just Krauss and Fried. I've read, panels where they would get into it, and that would happen every few years or whatever. But actually, a really interesting way of framing that dynamic that I came across a while ago was Jeff Wall did an interview with Michael Fried, and um, part of what's really interesting with Wall is that he says, I think it must be in the 70s. He says, because he was in, I think, Vancouver, Canada, and he's like, okay, well, I'm an artist. I need to kind of go to a urban center to, get out of podunk Canada and, meet the real guys. And he decided on London because he specifically didn't want to go to New York because he had read Michael Fried and Greenberg and was aware of, the sort of debate, and that he saw the dynamic in New York as being so polarized against any sort of notion of formalism or sort of even like experiential value in art, and that sort of this critical language was sort of taking dominance, and sort of the whatever post-structuralism and sort of the yeah, institutional critique and all these things were sort of like rising up, and that this sort of more conventional art historical position that that Greenberg and Fried at least were tied to, um, was totally demonized. And so he decided to not go to New York because he didn't want to take a position on that dynamic. So he went to London, where he thought he could, he wouldn't be burned at the stake for saying, like, I have read Greenberg and maybe didn't hate everything he said. Um, so yeah, I think that it's been historicized as a sort of polarizing, polemic for a really long time, and it's really only very, very recently that the the possibility of sort of reading it um, while like allowing it to be ambiguous, it has come around, um, and yeah, and that's sort of like a what I was saying sort of about, the sort of the 60s and all that, like I just random aside that I thought of earlier was that I was like looking through a collection of PDFs a friend sent me, and it's all like 70s through 90s random like artists' writings and stuff, and it just struck me the sort of productivity that was so sort of uh, palpable when you look back at sort of the way, artist writings and sort of people writing about whatever postmodern ideas of art were it was just really like a productive time for a good 30, 40 years. And it's only really recently that sort of the assumptions of this sort of anti historic, not anti-historical, but anti sort of traditional art history. I'm just saying that in the sense that, like, these old German guys like Alois Riegel or whoever, they're like a sort of, uh, there's a sort of stability in sort of the way people wrote about Renaissance art, in the 19th and early 20th century that is broadly compatible with Fried and Greenberg, and like at least the way they approach paintings, and that there's strong break, particularly with October, that was that sort of tries to sweep all that away. And um, and so I think my kind of position that I've been trying to take for the last few years is that um, not only should we not sweep away everything before the 60s, we should also not sweep away everything after the 60s. And I think that is something that surprisingly few people have cogently argued in ever, weirdly. But what was your first question?
The first question is more about like if we have any idea of like what were the conceptions of like art as an infrastructure,
Right.
like because I think that one of the, like I was saying, like one of the really interesting things to me thinking about like how this sort of critique would be made now
Yep.
is that like even thinking about these kinds of like figures like that I think that are like really like popular critical figures that kind of I think they exist kind of at really like awkward spectrums. Like I can think of like people who also like depend on virality. Like in Mexico, there's like a very famous like critic that kind of she's not very taken seriously, but she kind of like goes crazy on the numbers on social media, and she's like very much about like contemporary art destroying traditional values, kind of very conservative.
Okay.
And even someone kind of like I think like Brad Trammell, I think in an interesting way, they very much focus on the infrastructure behind like what happens in art. Like I think that for a lot of different reasons, they kind of don't look at art as the product of artists and
Mhm.
kind of very look at it as this very kind of like materialistic, like art is what is allowed by institutions and supported by fairs. Like there's a very like economic structural way of looking at art production now. And I
Right.
was wondering, and it seemed interesting to me that kind of the object of the critique here was like very like named artists. It was like, oh, it's these people and it's these people and it's this last name. And even kind of at the end, like that last section, he kind of has that like, oh, I'm sorry if this will make other artists and other critics mad.
Yep.
So I was wondering, like was there like a notion in that time that like art is moved by whatever artists are producing and writing, or like what was like maybe like what was the conception of the art apparatus, maybe if
Right.
that's
Yeah. So I would say I think that I think those things were very soon going to be developed. I think they were maybe sort of nascent, like in their beginnings in 1967, but by 1972 or something, it's pretty much in full swing. And then by the time October starts in 1976, it's like completely starting to take over the entire narrative. And I think that's the thing sort of about um, minimalism and its history is that it's a relatively brief period before it sort of then drifts into, land art and post minimalism and conceptual art and institutional critique and all these modes that are sort of like minimalism is an interesting sort of moment of in a sort of purist modernist sense, taking art and turning it into like a self-conscious sort of self-aware object of the sort of way art functions. But the ramifications of that self-awareness very quickly turn into a sort of um, systemic critical apparatus that like land art I think is an interesting question. I mean, and Smithson is of course the guy for that, but he and I think Smithson is particularly interesting because he's an extremely good writer and a very deep thinker in a way that is I think necessary for his work to sort of retain its value in a way that I'm skeptical of a lot of other land art because I think um, Smithson I think is someone who has a very tight understanding of these dynamics of what the what he uses all these like dialectics of like the map versus the territory and sort of the representation of a landscape versus the physical act of being in a landscape and thinks really hard about those things and then manages to create objects out of that inquiry he's doing. But when I look at a lot of other land artists like Michael Heiser or Nancy Holt, I find myself thinking like, you guys are kind of cheating. Like you just made a tube or a mound and it's outdoors, and being outdoors is already pretty cool. So like you're kind of like, you know, you're and I think that's the thing of that is that issue of sort of that the art becomes about being in the world. And I think this is sort of the validity of Freed saying, we are literalists most or all of our lives, is that like we are people in space all the time. And I think, land art is a necessary and important step in the ramifications of that the development of minimalism, being like, well, okay, well, if we're just doing this stuff about space, like why are we bothering to do it in a white cube gallery? Like I think that's a important move, but it's also a move that kind of underscores the the underlying sort of arbitrariness of what the artist is actually doing. Um, So yeah, but to go more into the direction of institutional critique and all that, I think that sort of and sort of what I hope we'll get to more because we didn't end up assigning that much of the like October stuff that we don't like, but I think that a lot of sort of the legacy of October is moving violently away from Freed and Greenberg representing looking at an artwork as the point of art and saying like absolutely not. Like don't have a sensuous experience of a painting. Do anything but that. That's not what art is about. It's about other things. And it ends up being sort of like art is about critique, and it's a critique of art. It's a critique of the institutions of art. It's a what it is a better way to put the thing with land art is that it's land art is a becoming aware of the institutionality of art itself as a social monetary system and the desire for artistic experience to be something that is unbounded by social edifices. But the problem is, especially with land art, is that you just look at the Dia Art Foundation, and then you're like, okay, well that didn't work because Dia is like completely just so screamingly moneyed and like suffocatingly self-serious in a way that I think undoes whatever sort of radical position Smithson wanted in the 60s. Um, so 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 I think that's the thing, I guess. Easier even than that, the easiest way to put it is that I think minimalism and this, the implicit developments of this is a sort of um, self-reflexiveness that starts coming into art. And that self-reflexiveness, similar to, like the optimism about culture in the 60s, that self-reflexiveness was sort of taken for granted as a mode of inquiry that was as inexhaustible as painting landscapes. That this sort of critique of systems and whatever performance or inquiry into the economics of museums. Like there's interviews with Andrea Fraser where she says, like, word for word what I'm saying, that she has no interest in sort of like traditional art because she thinks these new modes are no less uh are just as infinite as the traditional modes of representational painting and everything. And I think that hasn't come. I think the issue that has come from all this is that actually this sort of reflexiveness of art about itself does have sort of if not necessarily diminishing returns, has had diminishing returns, which is, I think, more of a like what I said earlier, that that these sort of conditions of minimalism were sort of specifically related to the way people approached art in the 60s and 70s, and that we've lost that on some level. I think that there's been a sort of regression. The cultural regression has canceled out sort of, not canceled out necessarily. I'm not trying to make like a blanket statement that institutional critique is impossible now, but I do think the conditions for it were fragile, and that it is hard to sort of summon up the idea of a space where these sorts of things would be possible again. So yeah, so I think the fragility of that, but also in terms of the problem of October, is that the reflexiveness of sort of a insistence on art being sort of critical or analyzing society, or you know um, political in a very deterministic way, in a sort of like what the art does is political and that is the content of the art, rather than sort of the consideration of how art itself works. Um, like that's my argument generally, with political art, isn't that it's art is not political. It's that art, like, art is political in the sense that everything is political. Um, that if it succeeds as art and has political content, then it is um then it works. But I think a lot of, like, I think what's very glaring now with, like biennials or something, is the presumption that art is uh radically political by categorically existing or addressing a subject overtly, in the wall text explaining why this wall hanging is political. Um, and I think that's mistaken, which is not to say that politics and art is mistaken. I think it's just the way in which it functions uh, is something that I think, basically, to sort of loop back, I think the way we got to this point where art at biennials is claiming to be, radically liberatory, is grounded in the aftermath of rejecting Fried and Greenberg, leading into everything October was into, everything about deconstruction, that is not, I think there are plenty of valid, you know, writers and, you know, rhetoric, and, you know, a lot of it was of value, but I think it's sort of it becoming institutionalized as the granted rhetoric of what you learn about art in art school, and its sort of loss of sophistication in being sort of taken for granted has led to a lot of lazy approaches to art that are then considered above critique, because it's how can you criticize art that is for, you know, human liberation, because, you know, how, and the question is like that if you use, you know, sort of the October toolkit, then the question is, well, I don't know how to critique this art, because I threw out the conditions of judgment in the 60s. And so, you know, I think this is sort of like looping around to sort of the reconciliation that that we've sort of been talking about from the beginning. But you know, I don't know, that it reminds me of a funny thing that I saw Benjamin Buchloh do a talk, I guess like, I don't know, 2 years ago or something. And he said something along the lines of, well, you know, now like it was like kind of this book that came out, which was basically about, occasioned by his retirement from teaching. And he basically said, you know, now that I'm old, end of my life, I sort of find myself wondering, you know, why is it that some artists you know, remain uncompromised and, you know, productive of inspired work, like Louise Lawler, and some have capitulated to, you know, doing things like decorating fashion runway shows, like uh, uh, Daniel Buren, which is an interesting thing. I maybe to point out sort of from the outset, because the turn of the screw is largely about Daniel Buren's rejected work from the Guggenheim in, what was it, 71, 72?
71, yeah.
71. Um, and, you know, the work was extremely radical then, but, you know, it's, there's an interesting sort of paradox that I think is sort of the same paradox I'm talking about on a different level, which is Daniel Buren just made these stripes, and he's been making those stripes for over 50 years now, and he hasn't changed it. He drew a lot of water from that stone. He did a lot with it, but he had to start repeating himself at some point, and it I don't know the last time he did anything interesting. I think he kind of he got really complacent, which is, you know, I think the same thing with you can say the same thing about Carl Andre, or quite a few other minimalist artists didn't know how to sort of develop their work, and got kind of complacent or lazy, and, you know, these, and so, which is just to say, the reason I brought up the Buchloh thing was, it was really funny to me that he said, you know, at the end of my life, I wonder why some artists give up or run out of stuff to do, and some, you know, continue to do good work. It's funny to me because it's like, that's to me the first question, and for him, it's sort of like, you know, like at the end of his life, sort of this question he's suppressed and ignored for his whole career, sort of like the return of the repressed is, and it's just like, I'm like, yeah, of course, like, you can't, you've tried to like judge art without judging sort of the art, like I think to me it's implicit in the judgment of an artist and an artwork that, you know, that there is some sort of notion of like authenticity that Buchloh is idealizing while sort of refusing to make sense of it. So, it's just like a thing of like, well, yeah, like, uh, Daniel Buren's sold out, but like, what did you want him to do for 50 years? That these, um, the idea of just like an artist managing to not sell out to sort of persist is to me a important sort of element in what the exercise of artistic judgment is and what criticism has to concern itself with on some level. Um, Julian, I saw you raised your hand a few times.
Yeah, the Buren example is so interesting. And I think that in how you framed it as like the way that you just kind of described it, it was kind of like as a failure on his part as an artist, like that he just kind of like was willing to do this thing over and over. And I think equally, the question that I'm simultaneously inclined to ask is like, that also seems like a huge infrastructural failing, right? Like, how is it that we have an art world that is seemingly unable to hold him accountable to like making new good work over time or something like that?
Mm.
Um, and it seems like we seem to give passes to artists when they are super famous or they like do one thing that's like very iconic or something, and then for whatever reason we don't then kind of expect anything more of them for the next however many decades. I don't know, that's
Yeah, just a quick thing is that I think the other side of it too is or it's not even another side, it's just a different angle of the same point, is that I think there are not a lot, but there are a handful of artists who are prominent that I get the sense really hate art and wish, belong in a different field, but got a career as an artist and are incapable of giving it up. I think Andrea Fraser is another example of that. Like, I think her sort of aversion to art in general is pretty palpable, and for the last 20 plus years she's been kind of like the sort of her turn towards sort of play acting, psychoanalysis, and political activism has coincided with her work kind of being dull, because I think what was good about her work was the way she um sort of self-flagellated her own artistic celebrity, and then after the piece where she had sex with a collector, she kind of ran out of ways to do that inquiry. And I think I don't know, I read a book of her interviews a few years ago, and it was pretty palpable to me that she doesn't care about art. And actually, I think there's the acceptance speech performance one she does, where she at near the end of it, like she's playing these different characters through the speech, and she sort of like swaps between these different sort of personalities. And near the end, there's one where she says something about like how she used to love going to the museum, but she lost that love. And she like cries while she's doing it. And in the interviews, she says, well, I'm playing myself at that point, and I actually cry because I actually do feel that regret that I killed my love of art. And that, I think, is on a sort of individual level of just, sort of like a person's relationship to art, a sort of signal point about the um, institutional critique, the long arc of institutional critique, is that it does not encourage one to have a relationship with art really at all. It encourages you to hate the institutions of art, and then kind of trap, if you're lucky enough to not have to get another job, then you're stuck doing something you hate in a world you hate, and it snuffs out your relationship to those things. And so that's, I think, to me, sort of on a like basically I think that was maybe the grounds I had for whatever critique I have of this sort of critical understanding of art is that my understanding of art has always been grounded in liking it and finding whatever I don't know being invested in it, and that I think the killing that investment is sort of obviously like a self-defeating attitude. But anyway.
Well, no, I mean, even just kind of like thinking about that and also like specifically, it's funny because one of the other things that I was going to bring up was I was reminded of there was a moment earlier in the conversation where you basically brought up like the very short-term historical amnesia that like most contemporary artists
Mm.
in the 21st century seem to have, or like that they're
Yeah, you mean like nothing before the 60s?
yeah, or even just like nothing before the 90s. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like in terms of what they're responding to, like it's very,
Yeah.
very short term. And I was reminded of Laura Owens and a thing that Laura Owens said where she was like, I think it was a panel for it was like a Mieris retrospective and she was on panel for it. And she was basically like, there's a kind of divide between painters. There's a divide within the painting world of like people who remember while they paint and people who just paint. And I think that particularly as you bring up institutional critique as like one trajectory to get you to like hate art or get out of art or something like that.
Mm.
I think her body of work is it's really unusual in that it attempts to reconcile like or it attempts to do painting out of institutional critique. And interestingly, the part that stuck wasn't the institutional critique. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Like people don't talk or think about Laura Owens because of the stuff that came from whatever her Cal Arts days and like that sort of influence. It's just the painting. It's just how it looks. It's just the visual thinking, whatever. And so I don't know that just it felt perhaps relevant or something. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that actually, yeah, interesting quote I remember from when I was like kind of poking around at interviews and stuff when she had her show at Matthew Marks last year was I found a quote where she said something like, I think she was talking about a Van Gogh show, and she said something about how she's really interested in the like immersive Van Gogh, those wall projection things, because immersive Van Gogh in, whatever 2022 had more guests than the Taylor Swift World Tour did. And like her point was that Van Gogh is like bigger in the cultural consciousness than Taylor Swift. But what was particularly funny about it to me is that, when I saw the show, I was like, I think even before I went, my first thought was like, oh, it's a, respected fine artist doing, working on the spectacle mechanics of immersive Van Gogh. And what I think's interesting about that, and I think what's important about your point about, the historical amnesia of sort of people not having any interest in art outside of the era they're living in or did live through is um is that, yeah, I think there's a sort of this is sort of maybe the other side of the coin of this like critical theoretical inheritance of art is the sort of like self-hating uh you know critical, analytic, smash the institution. Sort of just the easiest way to put it, I guess, is just the sort of the contradiction intrinsic to um trying to have an art career while being as aware as possible of how like unjust and tainted the art world is. And that just becomes untenable, I think. Um on some level. Not that I want to apologize for anything about the art world because it's uh, kind of a cesspool. But the other side of it is a sort of anti-theoretical hedonism that is sort of the, you could say it's like if the 60s broke off into, um, the like weather underground hippie Marxists versus the like Grateful Dead hippies, then like or not even Grateful Dead hippies, whatever, just like hipsterdom, like New York social culture being sort of like a driving force in art that, maybe sometimes has some theoretical interest, but often doesn't and sort of thrives off of the, you know, like what's happening on the Lower East Side in the 80s determines what the art in the 80s becomes. And that to a large degree, that attitude, I think, has been what sort of perpetuated art for a good, 3, 4 decades, in spite of, sort of the things you can critique about the like aimlessness of postmodernism and whatever, is that like sort of culture itself as a sort of social function um, carried itself for, whatever, from the 70s to the 2010s or something. I don't know. I'm not going to say when the world ended or something, but um, the the thing I think the issue of this impasse is the what I saw in sort of Laura Owen's comment about sort of having this investment in immersive Van Gogh and the Taylor Swift tour is sort of taking for granted that what is happening in the present is um, intrinsically the basis and the conditions from which new art is going to emerge. And that's not wrong. Like, of course, art has to deal with the present and has to, distinguish itself from the past. It has, like I think, like, since I'm kind of anti avant-gardism at this point, I think, but I think what art does need is it does need to be new in the sense that it avoids falling into historicized cliches. That you have to do something that distinguishes the present from the past. And I think that's close to Freed's claims that art has to, stand up to history or, be adequate against, whatever the one's forebears. Um, but it's not even necessarily a concern with sort of like the masterpiece or being the next whatever Titian or something. It's the you have to do something that reflects the present that isn't caught up in sort of repeating the idea of painting that you receive from historical painters, because historical painters were painting their present, and if you're recapitulating what Picasso did 100 years ago, you're just doing a bad impression of him, which is something that and this is I think where postmodernism gets really gummed up, is that um, in the 80s people do start recapitulating the past, like ironically or in a sort of shameless way or something, um, and it worked. What worked was the irony in the recapitulation. Um, and this is sort of the issue of whatever, like people trying to do appropriation art now, or trying to do like a Kippenberger rude, I don't give a shit attitude in their work, is that the imitation of an imitation is uh going to have what's the word, it's not going to pay back as much as it did the first time. Um, so so the this is, I think, just something that I've been thinking about because, I have in other talks and stuff brought up or tried to like champion an idea of history and art as a valuable thing. And I think people often take that to mean a sort of belief in, tradition or whatever rigorous structure and, academic standards or something. But what really, I think the easy way to put it is simply that um, I think I'm only advocating for an engagement with art as a field um, across history. That like, that whatever the uh I like Romanesque capitals. I don't wish contemporary artists made imitations of Romanesque, churches. It's that I think in my appreciation of it, there's an understanding in of what art consists of that that is just sort of like foundationally necessary for uh for what artists need to care about. And I think there's a certain stuntedness that arises from just sort of taking the present for granted as being enough. Um, and that I think, the sort of cut off from history feeling is something that is very unique to the present because, it's like whatever, like it's trite, but you know, there was a lot less media around in the world. If you wanted to be an artist in the 60s, you couldn't, amuse yourself without at least, reading a book about whatever Leonardo. Like, this stuff had to, the history was implicitly a part of it. And it's only a very recent sort of like high postmodern condition where people sort of take for granted that the present conditions, which are, of course, the present conditions are important to what art is, but that they're sufficient hasn't even been a possibility um, until, post the internet. But I don't know. I feel like I've been ranting for a while. Does anyone have anything else they want to say? Yeah, Alice?
Hello. So, part of my reason wanting to be in this seminar is that I've also been like rereading Greenberg and Michael Fried. And one of the things I'm concerned about really is medium specificity, because I feel like this cul-de-sac that we're in right now, how to get out of it is really to think about like the condition in which the physical object exists. And one thing that I wanted to maybe throw into this discussion is a long time ago, I read this essay by Greenberg. It's called The New Sculpture. And I wrote this line. After reading Fried, I found it. And so he says, it's really fragmented, so it doesn't really make sense yet, but call attention to their mediums, or the new sculpture calls attention to their mediums, which does not disguise or render itself transparent in order to grant us the quickest possible access to their content or subject matter. And so the kind of, I guess, what you've described, and to Luis's point, this whatever medium that artworks take place now pretends that the actual matter is transparent, and that you mentioned earlier the didactic panel becomes really where the meaning of the work exists. But and this is why I'm interested in Greenberg and Fried, is that it's so refreshing to read because there's no sort of formalist criticism that exists now. Everything goes straight to subject matter. And so, but because subject matter is so, like, a lot of artists, unfortunately, as you said earlier, have to deal with a lot of pain. And this kind of trafficking in trauma is something that you can't really criticize either. So I think that the way out of it is maybe to look at the medium in which the form exists in. And yeah, I guess that's maybe.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point that I think that's in a way the crux of the argument is medium specificity and is um formalism because um and in a way this is sort of the easiest way to put it is Fried and Greenberg really do want to preserve the space that the work is in and refuse the sort of attacks of these outside elements, uh, or not attacks, but sort of like the seeping in of outside information or content or signifiers, allegory, whatever. Um, and the detractors of Greenberg and Fried sort of want everything except for formalism. And I think it's an easy sort of it's not even a middle ground. It's just sort of like, well, what if formalism like I think that you can have a formal understanding of art that doesn't preclude these other factors. And I think for a long time it has felt like that it was one or the other and that it was untenable to bridge that gap. And that's a sort of a contradiction that I think kind of can dissipate pretty easily if you just sort of identify it and say like, well, maybe we can just do both. That you can have a critical reflective experience of sort of the way an artwork considers the institution, that isn't disconnected from aesthetics as well. That there are that's something I remember I said to a friend. I guess we were doing a podcast a while ago, and he's a big fan of Michael Asher, and I said something that I said, well, oh yeah, Michael Asher's work, I've always liked it because it's so beautiful. And he's like, what the hell are you talking about? Michael Asher's work is beautiful? Like, did you just say that? And I said, yeah, I think his work is beautiful in the sense that, you know, Wittgenstein's Tractatus is a beautiful, that there's aesthetic content to this logic, that the logical intellectual rigor of Michael Asher is aesthetically valuable. And I think this is another sort of layer to it, which is sort of like a thing that I landed on, and it's taken me a long time to realize how um, extreme of a position it is that um, I've I've always thought or suspected that um, conceptual art still has to work aesthetically to succeed. Um, Even on the glib level of an excuse that if a, art student writes something on a piece of paper and they say it's their conceptual artwork, I don't really care what it says on the piece of paper because I can already tell that they're doing this tired, faux conceptual gesture, and I don't really care to sort of figure out their inquiry. So there is like a sort of on the level of a conceptual artwork, um, setting up the grounds to read about and figure out what the hell the artist is doing. Like there does need to be the sort of framing that introduces the information that is still at work, even in the most sort of anti-aesthetic, most, austere and disconnected work of art. But this reminds me of something that I wrote down, which was that I guess it's related to what I said at the beginning about how Freed is weird because he kind of like Greenberg's like the old guy, and you can kind of chalk up his failings and eccentricities up to his age, that whatever. Avant-Garde and Kitsch was written in 1939, so he's someone who is aging out by the time he was pretty much fully aged out by the time Art and Objecthood came out. And Freed is sort of trying to continue that at the point where it's sort of untenable, and for someone of his age, it's almost, you could say like inexcusable that he tries to continue doing it at that point in time. But the oh crap, where did I write it? Okay, okay, wait, never mind. I thought this connected. I was reading a different line. But I think that's worth thinking through. But the I think it's you can say it on a simple level, like the this binary that we're dealing with and trying to like break down is you can make it glibly on the level of like political polarization, where like of course these reactionary conservatives are wrong for their positions, but then like it doesn't mean that like the sort of institutionalization of relativism doesn't have problems with it. But I think the better way to frame it, actually, because I wrote that down and then I decided that was getting into muddy water, so I shouldn't do it. But the better way to frame it would be just like you take like judgmental New York hipsters who sort of are kind of ensconced within the system of art and the signifiers of posturing as a cool artist, or just fully driven by the sort of signaling of cultural cachet. And then you compare that to sort of like hippie, or like you know like like tender queer communities where sort of like judgment is oppression, and like clearly both extremes at their most extreme have problems with them, like that you can't ground judgment in objectivity anymore. But also like the refusal of judgment as a condition in society is untenable. So which is just to say that I think um that judgment is just something that remains possible after all these decades of sort of critiques of aesthetics, and like the whatever October saying that sensuous experience is like fundamentally bourgeois, so we're not concerned with it. That I think that that's a sort of it's a sort of repression of one's own sense of subjectivity, as if that was a negation of subjectivity into like a higher truth about art. But that I think actually which, so to reframe it, is that that would be sort of like the October Buchla whatever position is, or Krauss or something, that sensuous experience of art, looking and judging, is a reactionary traditionalist move that we reject by our new structure of how to understand art through whatever Marxism or semiotic theory or whatever. And then Fried and Greenberg are stuck in this sort of traditionalist notion of the continuity of art as a sort of like traditional standards that art should be continually held to, which is argued for much less cogently by any right-wing art critic, in the last 50, 60 years. And that I think these two things are less sort of contradictory than they look, in the sense that precisely, what I more or less started out on is that the history of these things that were supposed to be breaking away from history, the sort of the idea that, the minimalism is putting art history behind it, is contradicted more than anything simply by history and by the passage of time that puts these artists in the history books and makes it therefore something fixed by being in the past. And that this sort of like basic notion of temporality allows for the reconstitution of judgment, because these things simply aren't happening in the present now. They already happened in the past, and therefore we can view them in a more distanced manner than the sort of contemporary commentators did. So, in an ironic sense, the sort of institutionalization of minimalism, postmodernism, etc., by October, by these like art since 1900 textbooks that they wrote, they sort of defeated their own program by simply becoming the institutions that they were. They grounded their work in the critique of the institutionality of art, but they themselves became the institution. So that institutionality actually gave the work the possibility of it being judged as art in a sort of traditional sense that they tried their hardest to resist.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that, you mentioned the word criticality, and I think that, this notion is always evolving. And so what was critical, let's say, in the 70s is no longer critical now. And I think that
Right.
this is for me why formalism maybe could be something interesting, because I'm a maker, and I think as an artist, it's difficult to find the language to articulate, what is not institutionalized right now, or what is not dominant, because it's something that's not recognizable for me even. And
Mhm.
it's very difficult, especially because formalism is so hated, that I even feel almost like I'm not allowed to talk about my work in the formalist tradition, and I think for me, geometric abstraction, that, starting from the early 20th century, continue on with minimalism, like that movement is so important. I wouldn't be an
Mhm.
artist otherwise. And I think this idea of like shapes and colors, it just sounds stupid if you just say shapes and colors, but actually when you read Freed, he's talking about shape,
Mhm.
and that's really refreshing. But I wonder if that's why I'm really curious to read the other texts in this seminar, if there are other, critics that do formalist critique.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, let's see. Who do I like? Um, I mean, yeah, I think in terms of, art writing since Freed, there are, I mean, I guess Barbara Rose is one, but I haven't read much of her, and I don't know how undeserved her bad reputation is. But I think, I don't know, Kirk Varnado is a really good art writer. He was the director at MoMA before he died tragically young, but he has a good he wrote a great text for the Jasper Johns retrospective in 2000 or so, and has a really good, there's one called Pictures of Nothing, which is all about formalism basically. And that's actually, it's a lecture series, and the lectures are all on YouTube. Um, but I think Something that and I think this is sort of the way this sort of I guess my own sort of rambling is sort of maybe I'm catching myself doing it, and I think it's maybe a useful um, movement is sort of trying to avoid catching up in the sort of formalism versus the whatever political, whatever rhetorical approach to art. Is that rather than sort of saying like, we should, I mean, of course, formalism shouldn't be as demonized as it is. And also implicitly the fact that, this sort of um narrativizing of art that's sort of uh forced on artists, I think in a academic setting and in like a institutional setting, if not a gallery setting. Um, like it's so enforced. Of course, it must be a you know, a rigid ideology that should be questioned at the very least. And I think, that there's a sort of uh, sleight of hand in the sort of like, well, this is politically progressive, so you can't say anything bad about it, even though it's sort of the, you know, whatever hammer in a glove that the institutional functions of art have adopted post-institutional critique to keep things manageable. So I think my point with this is that I think the thing I go back to is not even formalism, but just sort of like the um, Cézanne is always relevant. That there's always something to learn from looking at Cézanne and thinking about what he was trying to do and what he was grappling with in, paint and his application of the paint, and that there's a depth of struggle and uh, uh, um, a something captivating from that struggle that he manages to get on a canvas, and that struggling is what um, art consists of. And that's, I think that's maybe a way of reframing sort of the self-consciousness that is sort of on display with minimalism, is this sort of like the artist does something, and that what they're doing is what's compelling, more so than a sort of, technical sort of whatever, like looking at how intricate the brush strokes are in a whatever old painting. There's like a sort of a transference of between subjects in the subject of the artist and the subject of the viewer that is occurs within the art object, and that there's a, I think I guess I don't think I'm being whatever dramatic, but I think, that there's an infinite ambiguity in what and how, what is being transmitted between an artist and a viewer through the art object, and how that happens is that's infinitely variable. If individual artistic mediums or the blending of them is not necessarily infinite, then the sort of um, communicative character of art in itself is inexhaustible. And that, that there's a sort of like immanence of lived experience that art deals in, and that I think a lot of the rhetoric in the 20th century has ended up obscuring that. And that, like, and I think that's sort of the it's sort of like the underside of the iceberg of the debate that's happening up top in art and objecthood is that like none of this rhetoric really matters from a like ontological perspective of art as a whole. It just happens to be a sort of like moment of self-consciousness that was occurring in 1967 that was being debated. And that self-consciousness is valid and involved in what art is, but art fundamentally is not either side of what is being debated. Yep.
Well, I had a response to Alice because what Alice said, I found what you said, Alice, really interesting. And I'm inclined to uh when you kind of like bring up this question of like formalism, um, I think mostly about language and about the term formalism and how I think by disposition it sounds like I'm fairly similar to you. Like I would also probably I'm more inclined to think about things in formal terms or maybe like contextual like or like I think about like the history of the context of different kinds of formal thinking or something. Um, but I think that if you bring up formalism, even if you are specifically referring to it as like formal thinking, what people will go to, like 9 times out of 10, if you're in the art world, is Clement Greenberg, right? Very specifically. And at least in my experience, whenever I've like gotten to that place of thinking about like, I don't know, how do I find a critic or a thinker who thinks about things in formal terms? Um, I more am instead, I'm kind of inclined to think about it not like I don't really go toward formalism as a term, or I perhaps have like opted to instead think about it in terms of just like criticism that deals with the art object in question or the artwork in question, um, as opposed to trying to find someone who has been able to resuscitate or redefine formalism in the wake of how that term has been changed or disfigured or something by Clement Greenberg or like defined across the field by Clement Greenberg. Um, and I don't know, I also just think that like language in art and objecthood in general is really interesting. And I found like I found it quite fun to like try to figure out how like what theatricality or what objecthood actually meant to him.
That's good because it doesn't have to be fun.
Sorry.
It doesn't have to be fun. It can be a pain in the ass.
Yeah, no, totally. But it's like interesting. It's inherently, it's like, it's a weird, elaborate, completely counterintuitive, like, but it's like, it's at least a thing that he's like tried to build, which I don't know. I kind of appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the way we put it at the beginning is that it is fundamentally a problem. It pinpoints a problem that is something that doesn't go away, um, that has not yet been settled, and I don't think even like, and that's I think that's the sort of thing that I think from the Melville Smithson perspective is that it's not about settling it because it is not about one side winning the debate. It is about sort of the ambiguities of experience that were revolutionizing art at the time, and that like the consequences of that are still being played out, and I think will always be played out in the ways that art is always renegotiating itself forever. And I think that's the thing. What you said about formalism is that I think that's sort of my um, basis is, that I knew some things about contemporary art when I started writing criticism, but like what I had been interested in for a few years before was really like, Walter Pater and Roberto Longhi and, just Renaissance art critics because I liked that. I mean, these are contemporary or like 19th, 20th century writers about the Renaissance, because I liked reading them because you would receive their sort of refinement of their discipline and their knowledge of how to navigate a painting, and that process of sort of the close looking and investigation is to me, you know, the foundational element of it that is what I like from art criticism, and I prefer that to sort of a, you know, interpretation. Like I would rather have someone explain to me, you know, how to look at a Piero della Francesca than sort of like an essay interpreting the symbolism of the figures. That, you know, that's closer to what I enjoy about painting. And, you know, I think actually that's, yeah, I think to go back to the Alice's question, if there's any formalist critics, I think oddly enough, TJ Clark is someone who's, you know, one of the best writers on, who just is good at writing about the painting and what's going on in it and making you look at it and making you enjoy his description of the thing he's making you look at. Um, but you know, and he's an interesting counter figure sort of in this, because he's someone who had, you know, debates with Greenberg and Fried, and is, you know, a Marxist, whereas Fried and Greenberg are, you know, relatively inexplicitly conservative, or well, at least in Fried's case, Greenberg's pretty conservative. Um, and yeah, Clark is a, yeah, it's interesting to me. I mean, this is a digression, but and I guess we're a minute over, but I don't know, whatever. I won't go into it. I just like TJ Clark a lot. I think he's I was thinking about him like as if he's my favorite art writer. He's I think the art writer I enjoy on a like, you know, it's like as in like it's your favorite flavor of ice cream. He's my favorite, but he's not my favorite in terms of like knowing deeply, like having like a deep connection to his work. Like I think he's great, but he's my favorite in a sort of purely like uh enjoyment of reading sense. But I guess we're done now. So um I don't know if we need to do any sort of housekeeping before next week. I think I don't know. I think we'll whatever. Emails will go out if we need anything else. I guess there's the I think it was at the end of the syllabus, but I guess the assigned work is there's I think 500 words response to the reading for every week, and then like a longer one for the final week. But other than that, I think we're good. So thanks everyone. And guess we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.